Welcome to Analyst Talk with Jason Elder. It's like coffee with an analyst, or it could be whiskey with an analyst reading a spreadsheet, linking crime events, identifying a series, and getting the latest scoop on association news and training. So please don't beat that analyst and join us as we define the law enforcement analysis profession one episode at a time.
How we doing, analysts? Jason Elder here with another LEA podcast deep dive. Before You Leap with Randy Stickley. Randy, how we doing?
Hey, Jason. Good. A long time no hear, bud.
There was a pretty big gap between episode 8 and now episode 9. And as I'm recording this, I just released episode 8. So it seems like it's fresh in my mind, but I do know that I've been hard at work, and my spacing between recording and publishing has ballooned to like 2 months. So it's been quite a spring into the summer for me.
Yeah, tell me about it, bud. I mean, I think the last time we saw each other was, my first conference bit this year in March at North Carolina.
Yeah, and I'm glad you're still talking to me after being neighbors at the hotel and waking you up early in the morning to see if you had any toothpaste because I ran out.
I've heard neighbors come by and ask for a cup of sugar. Hey, can I use your phone? Hey, Randy, do you have any toothpaste? Was the first.
Yeah.
It's a memory.
Yeah. No, my wife says there's no end to my neediness. So
I think my wife has said something similar, but that they get to say that.
All right, very good. Well, I'm glad we're still talking. I'm glad we're still forging ahead with Before You Leap. So before you leap, you should what today?
Before you leap, you should understand that mission integrity isn't guaranteed with silence or ceremony. We've touched on topics very similar to this premise. We talked about this even planning this session. This was probably, episode 4 or 5. It's somewhere in the mesh. They're all starting to blend together because there is a code message here, is that critical thinking is a Swiss army, not only for analysts, but leaders of analysts and those that are in positions that kind of necessitate the cerebral or cognitive process. But where this stems from, quite honestly, comes from just some personal observations as well as professional ones that colleagues, peers that I work with, the 9-to-5 space, as well as kind of the intelligent professional at large space, that many times the mission or the goal of whatever shop, the analytic, law enforcement, or committee, what have you, that mission may get sidelined. Now, when I say sidelined, it's kind of self. There's an entire conversation we can have there about the idea of mission, but I'm not quite going. What I'm going into is something a little more chronic, systemic, is something that really has reared its ugly head despite our changes post 9/11. The idea of identity politics, proximity, or even personality. We referenced this, I believe, even a couple episodes ago, that personalities play a huge role in collaborative environment, and there's no way around that. Basically, you and I get along, are true nerds for this profession, but beyond that, I think we have some Marvel likes and dislikes, but you may have different personal feelings about sports, about music, about food, and the same thing applies to me. So sometimes those personality traits, they will overwhelm and override good collaborative work. And that doesn't just happen at the line analyst level. This happens at leadership. The idea that things are done information siloed. And I know that's a big buzzword. It kind of gets folks' backs up against the wall when we talk about that, because that's a big thing that reared its head after the mission report. We've tried to mitigate those, particularly at the Homeland Security level and to some extent the NAFTA level. But as time goes on, as we get a little further from that driving force that got us into that mindset, we start to slip back into it. One, just because the idea that applying critical thought or critically asked role within a profession at large start to default back to what makes you. And what have we said throughout this entire series? That we are flawed specimens. We are creatures that depend on base biases and kind of ambition to get us through life. But that off profession well. So then I talk about this, and I referenced this to some colleagues before, but there's a really good Mark Lowenthal quote that came from one of my favorite books on the profession, Intelligence Secrets to Policy. Mark Lowenthal has this really great quote. I'm going to read it now. He stated that tone and rigor of intelligence work are set not by structure, but by those who understand that quality intelligence depends as much on culture and openness as the access. So when we do things in an information silo or an echo chamber, or in maybe a group versus out group kind of perspective, perspective, you're not really opening the door for what we call cognitive or objective. You start to kind of retreat to some of these biases that we have referenced. So we've talked about things such as confirmation biases, which could even kind of flown an authority bias, where we think that a governing body or an authoritative posture automatically the right one to go with because of title, because of position, and not because of knowledge or collaboration. Or the idea of organizational satisficing, which I'm so glad I didn't butcher that word because I have it in my notes here. I underlined it 3 times, satisficing. But effectively, that we're just going with a party line. We're going with an organization. Like I said at the beginning, just because it's a norm doesn't necessarily track. A lot of folks, and I'll go with a very basic example, look at Jim Crow era of the United States. A lot of what was being done in the South, a lot of folks saw that as, hey, it's the norm down. Mm-hmm. But casual racism and urban racism, for that matter, wasn't good. But it's not a do. Just because it's a cultural norm didn't make it right. So with that being said, a lot of those unchecked biases will start to proliferate. They will start to contribute to maybe a degrade of the mission, a miss of the aperture with the final goal in mind, or even kind of an organizational or professional failing overall. And try to wait. So thinking about this, critical thinking does have a play here, not just at the leadership level, but all the way down line analytical. I'm a big champion for this, and I will continue to say this. Just because you're a line analyst does not mean that you don't have, especially if it's one that's based in facts or is offering some kind of content, as opposed to just sitting on your hands going, well, they said so. So what I often thought about is the whole of structured analytic techniques area, or SAT assumption checks that we often think about in these types of roles. Many times these norms are based on conjecture or maybe haphazard information, but even forming a mental checklist of, okay, well, where has this come from? Where was the data or what have you? Playing a little devil's advocacy or devil's advocate could be a great avenue as well. Quite honestly, I love contrarian techniques simply because it offers that external perspective or perceived perspective if you're somebody that's part of that organization, part of that unit, or part of that. But then there's also the idea of red teaming, starbursting, and so many other aspects where we could lend external cognitive abilities to objectively look at this and go, yeah, we're not on track anymore, folks. We're not necessarily achieving the goal that we set out to do. And more often than not, many people don't like to be confronted with that, but they view it as a perceived failure as a leader, perceived failure as a unit, a profession. But more often than not, it's a recommendation so we can get back on track and actually do what we're supposed to, which is lend that analytic fortitude of business endeavor, national security, or even private security. Make sure that something bad doesn't happen, someone has an actionable insight, and then hopefully an end goal or an end result enacted upon based on our insight. Again, from the large professional scale, this could be something as simple as making a more communal environment for folks to share information, making a more communal or rife environment for the next phase, start honing their skills. Maybe they won't be a leader within their profession or within their unit, but they would become that person at large. And Jason and I, speaking at conferences, you have podcasts, I go to conferences and the books and everything, and there's different ways to go about it. Sometimes you have to remind folks that it's not always about speaking in that echo chamber and speaking in a organizational, satisficing way, but more often than not, trying to cultivate the next cadre or the next cabal of leaders that are going to be innovative thinkers, great collaborators, utilize those core critical skills with some of these SH that I referenced as a way to mitigate other biases from the professional level, and then ultimately lead us to a more, use that word a lot, but that's truly the only thing that I can think, how do we get a closer harmony to analytics?
So there's a lot there, right? That's a big meaty meatball, as someone once told me. So I think where my mind is heading is the role of the analyst in a collaborative environment, whether that be a commission, a working group, a task force. There is this stated goal for what this group is supposed to achieve. It's amazing. The more critical thinkers you get in the room, the bigger the ballooning gets in terms of what is discussed and the scope. These leaders of these types of groups have to try to meet deadlines and keep the group on point. So then you have a situation, though, where some of the points being brought up are very valid and should be flushed out, but the group either doesn't have the time, resources, or energy to do it. And so there's this idea that, okay, you want me to be a critical thinker, but we also have to fit in this box and fitting this timeline. So it's very frustrating that we're trying to flush out everything to make sure we covered everything, but at the same time, we are handcuffed by the timeline.
Yeah, you raise a bunch of great points, supporting that, and then you also gave me a word. One of the things that you have to be really careful about is if you don't know, this is one of these big fouls that I hate to see from anyone, let alone someone analytic. But if there is ambiguous on answer, then say, I will get back. I used to train people. That was one of the biggest things I used to have a problem with was people that along the way, what's the big verisimilitude of this particular problem? And they go, well, and they would try to muddle through it. Say, no, I'll find that answer and get back. I used to train people. We used to go through briefings and fake briefings where they would say the same thing. And it's like, okay to say, I don't. Part of that transparency aspect. Now, that could play into the authority bias that we talked about earlier, where is this perception because someone has a position of leadership, acts in form of leadership, or has a leadership title, they have to have. And I learned this a long time ago, even from my first analytic boss, that the leaders always don't have the answer. Sometimes you would say something or come up with a question that even stumped a team lead, a director, a deputy director, or what have you. And I can even speak from my 9 to 5 perspective. There are times my team members will come to me and ask me a question that I don't have the heart or the professional fortitude to BS. You can ask any one of them. I will say, hey, I'm not that learned on that yet, but I'll get back to you. That is a nice little verbal contract, state that I have the candor and the kind of obligation to share information, to share insights, to collaborate further. And I think a lot of folks miss that, particularly whenever they get a fancy title or a seat of perceived power under their belt, because that's just something that we're accustomed to. And that's a whole nother psychological discussion that I think we would have to get a clinical psychologist in here to talk about complex touch.
Yeah, because I think it's definitely hard for analysts to turn it off and turn off the critical thinking, and sometimes we're told so often to think outside the box. In some scenario, you have to not go down so many rabbit holes and stay focused. And as I mentioned, the more players you get involved in on the team, the more complex it can be. It falls into play there that every decision of the working group, commission, task force has the potential of having a bias, because either the group is voting to go in a certain direction or the leader is making a decision that leads the group into a certain direction.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's also not only important from an organizational health standpoint, organization being any collection of people that work on this kind of centric goal, but also we've talked about this before and you hit on it, but analytic health from the analyst back. What does this do from the kind of fervor that someone lends to a project, the kind of tenacity somebody has or the passion somebody has? I know not many people are passionate about some task forces that they're a part of because of the very graphic and violent nature of some of it. But for those that are true nerds, which I would argue about anyone who comes gold, are a cognitive nerd, whether you realize it or not. And it's a proud badge to wear, but will start to degrade that. That will start to erode. And it's almost plating. And I use the analogy on suck right out of your sail, or just a boat in the dulles floating. And I think that's one of the worst feelings professionally to have. And if we were going to get past that, we really need to start having more candid conversations about how to contribute to better collaboration, better inclusivity, better communication overall. So I think those are some big bedrocks that lend themselves to committees, task groups, everything talked about.
Yeah. I think the advantage of the task force is at least there's normally a target involved.
You know what? You'd be surprised, though. I mean, sometimes people like to haggle, like, no, it's this target. Well, no, it's a secondary target over here. But that's part of a sitcom in my head that I live with constantly.
Yeah. And I think the idea of questioning assumptions, status quo, and norms, yes. I think this can be particularly difficult in these situations, this collaborative environment, because you are also working with people that it's their identity. You're dealing with either their job or their status or their title or their responsibility. And it may be a situation where critically thinking about their position or maybe stuff that they did or their responsibility is part of this. And of course, it's just natural for humans to get defensive when you're going to start questioning their roles, responsibilities, their past actions. Let's talk a little bit about that portion of this, dealing with just humans and people's emotions as you're trying to critically think. You have to take into account like what people's roles are in this group.
Absolutely. And no one likes to be questioned. If you have poured so much personal bandwidth into a project, topic, or a mission, like we said in the very beginning of all of this, no one likes to be questioned. However, when it comes to those questions, rather than getting defensive, and I'm guilty of this, I'm sure you are, and just about every listener, it's almost one of those times you got to take a step back, take a note. You know what? Only way around this is to tell the truth. Only way around this is candid, share that information. Also, share where some of those short. And I think that's also an occupational, professional blind spot that we have. And I don't know if we're going to get through it soon. But people feel like if they're not the one with all the answers, then they fail. And I'm here to tell you that's a fallacy. That is a self-imposed bias that we know. If we all knew everything about every topic, then our roles are either going to be utterly superfluous or nothing bad ever happens. That superfluous nature be that we know everything, therefore nothing can happen without us knowing. But then also you render yourself occupation. So I think that candidness, or I feel that this should be a bigger part of this, from the line analysts to your leaders and everything.
So this conversation reminds me, recently interviewed David Cairns for his new book, Outrageous: Investigating Mass Shootings, in which he goes into the book his frustrations with commissions that he was on to investigate mass shootings in Virginia. It's interesting what a commission or a group, what they're tasked to do, because they are trying to identify issues in order to change the future. This is how do we do it better the next time? One of David's frustrations that he quickly experienced with the commissions is there was a consensus in the group that they didn't want to hash out all the details of the shootings. They felt that it was reinvestigating what had happened. Not that you're questioning every little motive or whatever happened in critical times, right? There's certain times where you can't have democracy. A decision has to be made and you make the decision. It's one person's decision. You don't have time to get 17 opinions on the matter. Given that, in that particular time period, when you're at the commission level and you're at this time where you're reviewing what happened in order to change policy and procedure, that is very much the time to review and state what happened, what went wrong, or maybe not even wrong, but maybe like, okay, in the future we need to do it this way. We need to tweak that. But it's difficult because, again, people don't want to relive the past. They only want to move forward. But it's almost that thing like, how do you move forward when you're not going to review the past?
There is the old adage that I think's been overused to hell, that those who don't know their past repeat it. But I will say, and I'll go to another big tenant in the intelligence thought space, particularly from the ethics of intelligence space, going back to Sherman Kent's ethic. One of the biggest principles that he preached was having that candid admission of shortcoming, not thinking you're infallible, not sitting there, you are and I'll take a line from Deadpool and Wolf, not analytic Jesus. You're somebody who can have faults, and that's perfectly fine as long as you know what that fault was, improve upon that, and carry forward with that new line of thinking. I think really hit on that there, but I think it's definitely worth giving the Sherman Kent buzzword out there, because quite honestly, it's something that every analytic profession should truthfully have in the forefront. They work on whether it be a product, a working group, task force, or anything else.
All right, very good. This is obviously a pretty intense topic. Lots to go over. One of the things that also reminds me of that I've talked to several people that were part of real-time crime centers or fusion centers is just how many rabbit holes do you go down? as you're trying to work on something in real time, and how when do you stop, when do you start, when does the return on investment no longer be there? As we're going to wrap up here, we don't have a recipe for the listeners, right?
Right.
There's no recipe to say like, hey, when you're in these situations with collaboration, you should do X, Y, and Z critical thinking, but you shouldn't go overboard and do A, B, and C. So it isn't something that we can give you a special recipe for. This is very abstract topic. The interesting part of this conversation is it gets into the biases, it gets into personalities, and it gets into group dynamics. There's a lot there that we obviously can go into, but I just kind of want to bring us back a little bit and kind of summarize us and give us some final thoughts as we finish up this episode.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. There's definitely a lot, I know a lot of colleagues of mine say there's a lot of meat on the bone, but I think we have a really good foundation for understanding what this more grounded kind of problem is. A lot of our discussions, we try to ground them, but I think this one in particular, we're speaking more at the in the weeds kind of perspective, which is great. But I want to make sure that we lend proper time and due diligence to the discussion of how does this impact everything in the analytic perspective, particularly for the analysts. So one thing I will say is, how do you know where enough's enough? And we talked about this, I even think the last episode, about what's the burnout look like when you start feeling like you're not getting anywhere and you're not making any headway. That's where you got to take that professional fortitude, kind of step back and go, I'm not producing, I don't feel anything, or I'm not necessarily, or conversely, even getting too attached to it. There's that removal of the objectivity. So I think another great point moving forward, maybe another conversation, is what does that fortitude look like, and how does that lend itself to some of these principles that we've talked about for the last 8-9 episodes?
Yeah. All right. So we want to hear from you on the topic. So if listening to this and you want to give your own perspective, we'd love to hear from you. You can either comment on our social media, LinkedIn, Facebook, X, or any of the association forums. You can also email us at leapodcasts@gmail.com. All right, Randy, let's do a nice little summary as best we can to finish up this episode. So before you leap, you should what?
Before you leap, you should understand the mission and not let, silence, identity politics, or any other means of bias or avenues of bias throw you off of that mission and objectivity.
All right. Well, very good. Appreciate your time as always, Randy. Until next time, think before you leap.
Yep. Thank you, Jason. Talk to you soon, bud.
All right. Take care. Bye.
Thank you for making it to the end of another episode of Analyst Talk with Jason Elder. You can show your support by sharing this and other episodes found on our website at www.leapodcasts.com. If you have a topic you would like us to cover or have a suggestion for our next guest, please send us an email at leapodcasts@gmail.com. Till next time, analysts, keep talking.